John, Teston, Professor Mohanty, Professor Madhukar, and all our viewers, both on Zoom platform and Facebook platform. This is a transforming the subjective and the objective transpositional subjectivity is a book edited by Ananta Bhai, and it explores the contours of transpositional objectivity from multiple vantage points, some more theoretical, examining the concept itself as if it were an object under study, and others more experiential, considering it from a subjective stance. So let me invite Ananta Bhai to give a brief background of the topic of today's session and this creative book. So Ananta Bhai, over to you.
Thank you so much, Randhir, and thank you, dear and respected Lisa, and our respected friend John, and many other friends co-present, Gyan Luigi, Minati, Soban, and all friends. In fact, there is a beautiful line which goes like this, and I think it is from Tennyson. It goes like this: more things are wrought by prayer than the world can dream of. And in a very humble way, I add, more things are wrought by meeting than the world can dream of. And language is not only a space of meeting, but it is a kind of a movement, a spiral of meeting. And, I remember as if it is this moment, our very enriching meeting with Lisa and John, following our participation in two interesting conferences. But that morning meeting is so enriching, and then it helped us to get a little glimpse of our journey. And then it has been really enriching the way Lisa has really kindly, like a kind stream, flowing over, bringing her knowledge, her deep quest to many of our humble projects, including to this project of transpositional subjectivity and objectivity. In a way, language, it brings us together. And at the same time, if we are not reflective about language, the language also can make us into prison holes. And therefore, what Lisa in this very deep contribution talks about, really being aware of the infrastructure of language, but that infrastructure is not to be understood in a naive infrastructural way, but in a very constitutive sense. And that constitutive sense of language is that certainly language makes us self-subjective. At the same time, it also brings us together to a common concern and the objectivity understood in that space. So therefore, another very important challenge in thinking about language is, for example, noun and verb. But many of the primal languages, for example, both Sanskrit and Hebrew, and this has been pointed to by the great philosopher who is also a physicist and who really worked with Krishnamurti, and this great thinker, I'm just remembering his name. So in his work, he's reflecting how in the ancient Hebrew language, that most of the language has a verbal formation and it is not static. Similarly, in Sanskrit also, in the sense that noun is a moment in the verbal dynamics of language. So therefore, today, in a way, subjectivity and objectivity, now the problem is that they have been fixated too much on a kind of a fixed noun without understanding the dynamics. And so at the moment, as the river flows, as the language flow, there are many points of connection. So therefore, the moment we use objectivity, the language itself cuts us off from subjectivity. So therefore, one of the challenge is the challenge of a new language, which is not just a neologism. So it is in that spirit. So we are cultivating this language of subjectobjectivity, but it is not just a neologism, but it is a calling which has to be accompanied by multiple set of transformations, including bringing creative rethinking about language, as Lisa does, for example, in this paper, she brings the idea of holobionts that she would elaborate for us. And so with this, so it is a joy for us to welcome Lisa, and we are really grateful to you for your generosity and your gift to take part in many of our shared journey. I was particularly touched by your recent contribution for our volume on Professor Nadkarni, and in such a kind way, you bring this idea of linguistic sarvodaya, and that itself is so important, because Gandhi's notion of well-being of all, it's kind of the arising of all today, needs to be accompanied by this linguistic sarvodaya. So thank you, and looking forward to. Kindly unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Giri, for inviting me to speak. I'm very honored, and thank you, Randhir. I would also like to thank my early teachers, Professors Paul Desjardins and Ashok Gangadine and Lucius Outlaw, who introduced me to the thinking of non-Western cultures, from China, from Tibet, from Africa, and a little bit from India as well. So I extend my thanks to them for laying the ground for me to be here today. I think we should start with maybe a little more definition of transpositional subject objectivity, because it's not a concept that is in the mainstream. Would you like to do that, Ananta, or shall I read what you've written about it?
Maybe you can kindly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are Professor Giri's words, not mine. He says that agents are not only observers but also participants. The objectivity that emerges is not only objective but also subjective, intersubjective, and transsubjective. So we need to explore transpositional subject objectivity, one which emerges out of pluralization of the subjects, border-crossing transmutations among positions and transformative cultivation of the objective and the subjective, including intersubjective and transsubjective. It calls for transformation of the subjectivity and objectivity as we know, including transformation of these from nouns to verbs, and realize that as verbs they are not only active but also meditative, embodying and inspiring for what can be called meditative verbs of pluralization. Transpositional subject objectivity also calls for a new pragmatics of self and social communication, social dialogues, and contestations. For example, it involves communication of contested positions and the emergent subject objectivity that emerges from sharing and struggles. It helps us to overcome the dualism between subjectivity and objectivity. So this is our starting point, and it's a very important place to be right now, in our world history. And so it's with the intention of moving us forward as a collective that I present this chapter to you. So in this presentation, okay, which is based on my chapter in Professor Giri's upcoming book on this topic, I want to expand the purview of transpositional subject-objectivity to include all beings, comprising us as human beings, by considering the nature of holobionts, which means us as host to the many millions and perhaps even billions of microbes that live in and on us. This will be a test case for concretizing the paradoxical stance of subject objectivity. So as holobionts ourselves, I then suggest a move from talking about transpositional subject objectivity to speaking or communicating in any form from that perspective. To accomplish that, it is necessary to examine ways that our culture and the infrastructures of language, and I'll say more about that in a bit, maintain the prevailing assumption of a split between subjectivity and objectivity. So just as a house has plumbing that is hidden from view and footings that give it stability, language has infrastructures that enable it to function, but are rarely considered, and even more rarely are they ever questioned. And I want to note first, when I use the word our, I mean users of English. And when I use the term language, I can only refer to my native tongue, which is English. So some of the claims that I make for English might also be true for its parent languages, but not necessarily for other languages. So please evaluate any claims about language against what you know for your own languages. So by bringing some of the relevant infrastructures to light, I hope to further enflesh this paradoxical term and suggest ways to creatively envision speaking from such a dynamic perspective. I would like to share my screen too.
Yes, you can kindly use the share screen. Randhir, I hope you have kindly made the...
Yes, yes.
Yes, here we
The
go.
screen is visible. Thank you. Put it in presentation mode. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, now I'm going to need to keep it in this mode so that I can see my text, but I will minimize this over here. Okay, so to begin to develop ways to speak from a perspective of transpositional subject objectivity, let us first explore some implicit infrastructures of language and how transpositional subject objectivity functions within them. So I consider language to be a system of systems. Others have called it a complex adaptive system. I identify the following implicit infrastructures and exostructures that interconnect with and within language. And they are culture, category structure, logic, metaphor, semantics, syntax, and sign vehicle. However, more could be considered, such as phonology, but I don't get into phonology. Language exists within culture, and that culture's category structures. So these are the exostructures. They are bigger than language. Oops. And logic, metaphor, semantics, syntax, and sign vehicle are the infrastructures. Each of those topics could serve as a node for finer-grained analysis, and although it is possible to discuss each separately, I do not consider them to be separate, nor do they function separately. So like Borromean rings, they intertwine and overlap, and they operate together. Thus, as we analyze each, the whole must be kept in mind, all of them. Furthermore, there is a fundamental paradox that we need to acknowledge when inquiring about language, namely this one at the top. It is impossible to question the implicit assumptions of our language system without simultaneously invoking those very assumptions. So this enigma serves to further reify the assumptions rather than to free us from their constraints. Although a system of assumptions is necessary for language to function, it is also necessary that we users of this system become and remain conscious of those assumptions. So the terms transpositional and subject-objectivity function not only within the semantic context of a text, whether the text is this presentation, the book, or the entire discourse, wherein the meaning of those terms fluctuates according to who uses them and to what end. But more importantly, they also function within a largely more unconscious structure of categories and implicit metaphors that associate subjectivity with interiority and objectivity with exteriority. In English, although not in all languages, in some Native American languages, for example, this is not the case. Subjects partake of a category consisting of sentient beings or conscious beings, or perhaps even res cogitans. Objects, many but not all, tend to partake of a category of unconscious things or non-sentient beings, or res extensa. Thus, by combining subjectivity and objectivity into a single term, subject-objectivity, we are intentionally creating a category mistake. So, in the past, some intentional category mistakes have opened new fields of inquiry. For instance, in biology, prions combine features of both inanimate protein and animate virus. And in physics, we know that light behaves as both a wave, so here's like the wave in the double slit experiment, and a particle. Perhaps transpositional subject objectivity, when implemented culturally, will help shift polarized mindsets. Now, although individuals can implement transpositional subject objectivity in personal life, for it to be implemented in the collective, we must have a way to express it in language that embraces its paradoxical aspects and does not reduce transpositional subject objectivity back into subject objects versus object subjects. Thus, to speak about transpositional subject objects, which do not conform to standard categories, we will require shifts in the other infrastructures of language before we can integrate such paradoxical entities in and into everyday discourse and life. Although it is relatively easy to apprehend our own human stance as participants and observers, as witness and witnessed, it can be more difficult to acknowledge that other categories of beings also engage in life as transpositional subject objectivities. And we must further determine the boundaries of that category. Perhaps all creatures, great and small, who can respond to their environment are subject objectivities. So subject objects might also include beings to whom we have not principally ascribed subjectivity, such as our microbiome, which I'll talk about in a bit. But notice that treating non-human beings as subjects will require us to refer to them as who and whom rather than that. But what about rather than it? When English lost gendered nouns by the 1300s, the language defaulted to referring to all objects in the third person as it, rather than as he or she, as some languages still do. By predicating transpositional subject objectivity to more categories of beings, we humans will have to start considering the subjectivity of beings to whom we previously denied subjectivity. Thus, will mountains and rivers have subjectivity? And what about human-made items such as computers and toasters, screwdrivers and chainsaws? To consider the subjectivity of other types of beings, let's consider the curious case of holobionts. So, in order to integrate other types of living beings into our understanding of transpositional subjectivity, let's consider ourselves as the home planet to the many beings who live in and on us. Indeed, each of us is a holobiont, an entire community of beings that comprise us as an entity or as a species. Host microbe relations reflect a range of subject objectivities in various inside-outside combinations of self and other. Well, I should say so-called self and other. Some relationships remain outside-outside, such as microbes in the sand that cling to my foot when I walk on the beach. Some span outside-inside, as when I am infected by a bacterium or virus. Some traverse from inside to outside, as when I sneeze, and some remain inside. Mitochondria, for example, were originally a bacterium who took up permanent residence within human cells. We know that because their DNA differs from one's own DNA. Microbes are sensitive and responsive to their environment and have various capacities, depending on the species, to alter their environment, which can include altering its host's body and behavior. And they do this in order to support their own life processes. To that extent, microbes participate in their own survival beyond stimulus response or perhaps even instinct. Now, are host microbe relations transpositionally subject-objective? Or, to put it differently, do holobionts embody multiple layers of transpositional subject-objectivity? Probably yes, but even if the answer is ultimately no, holobionts provide a good test case for making this paradoxical concept more tangible. Perhaps by understanding the various subject objectivities of holobionts, it can help us transcend the absolutization and fixity of distinctions and confrontations. Indeed, the holobiont comprises a unity that includes multiplicity, that exhibits identity and difference. So I, as the host, recognize that my microbiome is part of my identity, while they are also sovereign beings in their own right. I would not be able to function without them, but they are not other, as we all comprise me. And this, of course, applies to each one of us and most other animals in the world, actually. So as I can recognize identity and difference, can they do so as well? Now, as you can see, the subjectivizing and objectivizing pronouns, I and they, are problematic vis-a-vis transpositional subject objectivity. Given the research on the microbiome, many microbes do recognize other microbial species, particularly those that compete for food or other resources. Although such questions might seem rather concrete for an inquiry about transpositional subject objectivity, they are essential to our being able to make the shift from an us versus them mindset to a mindset of us and them as one. So a challenge in languaging the interactions of subject objects, such as environment, host, and microbe systems, is that the microbes, the host, and the host's environment are at different scales and levels of organization. They are not part-whole perspectives, as in a cell organism system, but are thoroughly integrated whole perspectives. Microbes are whole organisms that can also comprise a part of a larger whole organism, which is part of an even larger whole ad infinitum. As such, they are distinguishable but inseparable. By seeing ourselves in different types of part-whole, whole-part, and whole-whole relationships, we can bring our connectedness across scales of magnitude and levels of organization. Given such complexity, it becomes clear that existing language is not structured to handle the multiple scales and perspectives, not to mention the subject objectivity of symbiotes. So let me give you a real example. The relationship among cats, rodents, and Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite. So while Toxoplasma gondii can reproduce in one place only, namely the gastrointestinal tract of infected cats, the parasite can actually infiltrate the brain of any mammal, including humans, by outsmarting the blood-brain barrier, which functions as a firewall to protect the brain from any unwanted influences. Once cats are infected, they then dispel this microorganism in their excrement. In Toxoplasma's ideal world, cats excrete the parasite and rodents subsequently ingest it. The parasite then forms round cysts throughout the rodent's body, in particular its brain. A cat, in turn, eats the infected rodent. The ingested cysts reproduce in the cat's gastrointestinal tract. The cat sheds newly hatched parasites in its feces, and the cycle of life continues. Under normal circumstances, a pathogen from an infected rat would be very unlikely to wind up back in a cat because rodents instinctively avoid cats. But toxoplasma infected rodents not only lose their instinctive fear of cats, they also begin to prefer areas that smell like cat urine. The cysts also boost activity in nearby brain circuits that control sexual attraction, causing toxoplasma infected rats that smell cats to become sexually attracted to them. Now, I did not make that up. Here is the reference in case you are interested. If we look at the microbiome from only a narrow perspective as microbiome and host, and not as holobiont, then we run the risk of ignoring the animacy of microbes, that is, their subjectivity, even if it is a different, collective, instinctual form of animacy for which we have few words in English. Hence, it is important to be able to switch perspectives, just as we can take our neighbor's perspective. If we can look at the system in question, such as our human body or the body of another life form, from the microbe's perspective, we will see that the microbe is a highly evolved organism fulfilling a role in and for a larger organism, exerting agency to survive. That larger organism, in this case, is not necessarily the cat, but the whole ecosystem. Toxoplasma might actually help keep rodent populations down. So to consider this entire situation effectively, the biologist, he's sort of a philosopher biologist, Stefan Harding, suggests that it might be necessary to personify the microbes. Now, unlike anthropomorphizing, whereby we project human characteristics onto other species, personification essentially gives them their own type of personhood, that is, subject-objectivity. While we fully know that they are not human persons, personifying could engender greater relatedness between humans and non-human life forms, who would no longer be seen strictly as other or as it. Such personification, as you know, has been anathema in science. Nevertheless, it might enable us to develop a radically different paradigm for biological and other sciences. Harding suggests that, quote, we must keep alive and nurture a sense of the otherness of whatever phenomenon we might be considering, allowing a strange kind of intimacy to develop in which the urge to control is replaced by a quickening awe at the astonishing intelligence that lies at the heart of all beings. We must oppose the tendency of conventional science to depersonalize the world and hence control it. End quote. However, the fractality of subject objectivities as physical beings is only half the picture. The other half pertains to our, as humans and holobionts, are existing within psyche as well. So sometimes this idea is expressed something like this: consciousness is more fundamental than matter. C.G. Jung characterized psyche as the totality of all psychic processes, conscious as well as unconscious. For Jung, the unconscious is both personal and collective. The personal unconscious is purely subjective, while the collective unconscious is composed of archetypes that are universally shared by all life forms. Archetypes are images of instincts, thereby connecting the psychic realm with the biological. Later in Jung's career, he used the term objective psyche for what he originally called the collective unconscious. The transpositional approach cannot be clearer. Psyche is within us, and we are within psyche. Psyche is both subjective and objective, though we are only ever partly conscious of its contents, if at all. Just as we can never know anything in itself, any Ding an sich, we can never know the entirety of the unconscious. Okay, now we turn to the language problem. Thanks to the ongoing research on the microbiome, we can see that human beings, as well as other organisms, are one that is many, or both unity and multiplicity, that, like Heraclitus's river, remains identical by being in constant process. A type of binocular seeing involving perception and apperception is required, which gives us a new kind of depth perception of the transparency of reality, as Jean Gebser might say. To put this binocular perspective into language in a way that is widely communicable will be a major advance. Okay, to be clear, it has not been done yet. I am speaking aspirationally here. This is my project for the future. So to go beyond talking about transpositional subject-objectivity, it is imperative that we question assumptions that are embedded and embodied in the exostructures and infrastructures of language. For example, current perspectives grounded in either or ways of logical thinking will need to be encompassed by perspectives that also account for both and as well as neither nor. In addition, the implicit or conceptual metaphors that subjectivity is inside and objects are outside of subjects, outside of one another, will require creative revision to express that they interpenetrate. So to bring a both and perspective into the many exo and infrastructures of language, I propose that we find ways to incorporate the paradoxical topological structures known as the Mobius strip and Klein bottle. So Stephen M. Rosen inspired this approach by using these paradoxical structures to signify the relationship between subject and object within the concept of being. Although a model of a Mobius strip can be constructed from a piece of paper that has two sides, the archetypal Mobius strip only has one side. Okay, so this is how you construct a Mobius strip. You take a piece of paper, and instead of making a ring, okay, let me get the camera here, which has an obvious inside and outside, you give it a little twist, okay? So I'll put a piece of tape there. So now this structure, hang on, let me stop blurring my background so you can see it. Okay, so here you end up with a structure that has only one side. If you run your finger around it, you will never have to lift your finger up from one side to the other. So locally, that is, at any point on its surface, it seems to have two sides. But when considered in its entirety, there is only one side. Oops. Like the Mobius strip, the Klein bottle embodies a continuum that encompasses a seeming duality. So I have here, thanks to my friend John Dotson, a model of a Klein bottle. So it too is a continuous surface that curls in on itself, and hence inside becomes outside. I used the Klein bottle as a model for the unity of complementarity because by its very nature, it requires a higher dimension that is not part of our everyday three-dimensional reality. So this is just a model of a Klein bottle, and a real Klein bottle requires 4 dimensions. So that characteristic points to the mystery of our existence, to the unknown, to the n+1 dimension. Now, although mathematicians describe the extra dimension needed for the Klein bottle to not self-intersect. So here you can see where it is intersecting itself. But a real Klein bottle, like the Mobius strip, would not self-intersect. It would be truly continuous. Okay, so although mathematicians describe the extra dimension needed for the Klein bottle not to self-intersect as another spatial dimension, Rosen maintains that the extra dimension is the depth dimension, as described by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which is a psychophysical dimension, much like psyche. Unlike the 3 spatial or physical dimensions, which Heidegger characterizes as pure exteriority, namely everything is outside of one another, the depth dimension is an interior dimension, the first dimension that contains all others as well as itself. It is self-containing. In other words, it is a paradox. Thus, the depth dimension allows for complementarities to coexist, for the movement and flow of process, for the unification of inner and outer, of light and dark, of self and other. It allows for Mobial and Kleinian structures to be more than just mathematical curiosities. Indeed, the depth dimension provides a way to integrate matter and psyche, object and subject. Rosen writes that phenomenology currently refers to being by using a sign, namely the word being with a capital B, that does not adequately convey the richness of the discourse about being. Essentially, its form cannot sufficiently express its meaning. The word being lacks the fullness of that which it signifies, in particular, the paradoxical quality by which being itself encompasses and transcends the seeming division into subject and object. Rosen says that, quote, being can be elucidated effectively only by surpassing the division of subject and object long prevalent in mainstream philosophy, but that the underlying semiotic structure of such discourse on being has been tacitly geared toward maintaining the split between subject and object, end quote. Physics research has revealed that material things, including human bodies, are mostly space, in the modern sense of space being, something that is devoid of matter, with some positive and negative charges zipping around somewhere. From that, I realized that everything, including me, might simply be space reconfiguring itself from moment to moment. Rosen uses the term spatio-subjectivity for such commingling or fusion of subject, object, and space. He characterizes it as a dynamic process or dialectical interplay, one evident even at micro dimensions, so in the quantum world. It is not an amalgamated thing. Rather, it embodies the inherent paradoxical movement of mobile and Kleinian surfaces, that is, transpositionality. Rosen suggests the need to unify all three modes of being toward a fully integrated psychophysical reality. Now, Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So thus far, I have discussed transpositional subject-objectivity from a perspective outside of that concept, commenting on it, describing a way to embody its paradoxes, and relating it to such spatio-subject-objectivity. But how does one be and communicate from the perspective of a subjective, objective human being? In the past, our ancestors faced a similar type of shift in their consciousness, one which seems obvious today. They shifted from thinking the earth was flat to integrating it into a sphere. So today we are faced with a similar but qualitatively different shift, from thinking that we are each separate from one another and from our environment to integrating our separateness with our already always interconnectedness with all that is. Actually, it's a little more complex than what this picture shows. In addition to relativizing our relationship to all of life, meaning we're not like at the center of it, we're part of it. There are layers and levels of scale, including like the microbial level, but also more than organismic levels of scale that include not just the physical levels, such as communities, but also non-physical levels, as in psychological and spiritual understandings of energy and fields. And of course, we are all connected. So imagine lots of lines connecting everything as a vast web. This shift involves not only changing how we understand the world out there, but how we situate ourselves within it in a conjoining with the world. So as we shift who we know ourselves to be from separate persons to an interconnected spatio-subjective supra-organism, we must concomitantly ask, how can we communicate from this new perspective? Perhaps we must revise not only our conceptual and cultural assumptions, but also the assumptions within language structures. Although philosophers, physicists, and poets have been fostering an emerging change of mindset, one thing that seems to have eluded many of them is how deeply embedded our current mindset is in the very structures of language. Not just the words, but the infrastructures that shape how words and other elements of language ought not to be combined. Notable rebels have included the physicist David Bohm, who advocated developing a Rio mode, or flowing mode, a verb-based form of language, and James Joyce, who experimented with altering the content and structures of language almost beyond recognition in books such as Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. The study of other cultures and their languages can also help us expand the horizons of our own. In addition, the recent blossoming of constructed languages, or they're called conlangs, expands the capacities of language, albeit by creating new languages rather than by altering existing ones. But I'm more interested, I think, in altering existing ones. Although humanity has been through several mindset shifts in the past few millennia, those shifts have occurred within a set of assumptions foundational to language structures that have not changed, or have not changed much. Just as words have sets of assumptions associated with them, linguistic structures such as syntax and logic do too. Although that is not news to linguists, it seems to have eluded many people who seek to solve today's problems by using the same mindset that created those very problems. So solving problems using the same mindset that created them is like trying to fix a leaky pipe by using a tool that causes more leaks. How do we extricate ourselves from such a vicious cycle? Hang on just a sec. Because both the problem and potential solutions are expressed in language that uses the same underlying assumptions, in order to radically shift the current mindset, we will need to shift, alter, or invent novel forms of language that are grounded in a different set of assumptions, such as those embodied by the paradoxical, Mobius, and Klein structures. Now, because language is a phenomenon of the collective, neither I nor any individual can revise the language that a group uses, as language requires agreement among users in order to be useful. Societies, cultures, and belief systems will all have to shift, while language also shifts. Now, unfortunately, large-scale systems, such as culture, beliefs, and paradigms, are some of the most obdurate structures because of their inherent interdependencies and redundancies. So we'll have to work hard, is what that's saying. Speaking about and speaking from. So individually and collectively, we need to be the whole beings that we are, in addition to the separate beings that we think we are. How do we speak from those paradoxical places of wholeness within greater wholeness? Let's look more closely at what it means to speak about and what it means to speak from. To speak about something, one stands outside it. separate from it, and describes it as an observer. When speaking about something, attributes are applied to it, or perhaps even projected onto it. Even if the something that we're speaking about is a someone, linguistically it doesn't matter. When we speak about someone, the someone becomes objectified. Sorry, I don't usually speak for this long at a time. Conversely, to speak from a given perspective, one participates in that perspective. This move is similar to personifying, in that speaking from another perspective neither invalidates one's own perspective nor identifies one with the adopted perspective. So, to speak about being a parent, one could generalize about the trials and tribulations involved in raising a child. You'd say things, for example, oh, it's difficult, it's rewarding, it's frustrating, it's caused me to lose sleep 6 days out of 7. But to speak from being a parent, you would say entirely different types of things. You would say things like, clean up your room, or do your homework first and then you can watch TV. You probably would not speak from being a parent to your boss, but you might slip into that mode with employees, much to their chagrin. Becoming proficient at speaking from another perspective might indeed require training in perspective taking. By imagining another's perspective, namely what it is like to be in their context, it might be possible to approximate it. So to speak about the concept of speaking from wholeness, it is necessary to address the paradoxes of being whole. First, it is not possible to speak about wholeness wholly. Ultimate wholeness is greater than we could ever put words to. So silence can be appropriate when speaking about or from wholeness. Henri Bortoft expresses the paradox of wholeness quite eloquently. He says, just as there are no independently separate masses on the large scale, there are also no independent elementary particles on the small scale. At both levels, the whole is reflected in the parts, which in turn contribute to the whole. The whole, therefore, cannot simply be the sum of the parts, that is, the totality, because there are no parts which are independent of the whole. For the same reason, we cannot perceive the whole by standing back to get an overview. On the contrary, because the whole is in some way reflected in the parts, it is to be encountered by going further into the parts instead of standing back from them. So you can hear in that the depth dimension. And Bortoft gets very close to saying Indra's pearls, but he doesn't quite get there. Now, although wholeness cannot be cut into parts, aspects of it can be distinguished linguistically. Any such aspects are intrinsic, not outside of one another. Bortoft emphasizes that wholeness is not an object with parts, so one cannot be part of wholeness in the way that a keyboard is part of a computer. Hence, speaking from wholeness begins in the imagination. Wholeness has no singular perspective. Neither does it have simple affirmation and negation of perspective. Rather, it is aperspectival, a neologism that John Gebser uses to indicate a liberation from exclusive validity of perspectival and unperspectival limitations. If aperspectival were to represent only a synthesis, it would imply no more than perspectival rational consciousness, and would be limited and only momentarily valid, inasmuch as every union is threatened by further separation. Our concern, he says, is with integrality and ultimately with the whole. The word aperspectival conveys our attempt to deal with wholeness. So the idea of speaking from wholeness can include any form of expression. So Picasso, in paintings such as this one called Femme Assise, was finding ways to paint from wholeness. This shows a woman sitting in a chair, and the observer seeing her from multiple angles at once. Because much of our use of language occurs unconsciously, we often fail to see how it structures not only our thinking, but also everything else we create in and through language, including government, including education, commerce, entertainment. To develop novel structures for language and thus for communal life, many people with many different skills and sensibilities, in other words, our combined social wisdom, are needed to contribute their expertise. The development of novel language structures is a sacred act. It must be done with all available information about possible downstream effects or consequences. In light of the unintended consequences of technology design that emerged from widespread use of social media, it is imperative that we proceed cautiously, because language mediates our relationships with one another, the world, and the transcendent. Hence, we should involve all of them with us in co-creating novel structures for language. Mystics have relied on non-ordinary types of language, such as poetry and paradox, to convey their visions of a both-and world, including one of transpositional subjectobjectivity. As a modern mystic, I propose that we build both-andness into the exostructures and infrastructures of our language and consciousness. After attaining a both-and perspective, we can then expand into a more complex pluriverse, a multi-perspectival, all-and world of many worlds. And you might recognize that sentiment from the Zapatista movement in Mexico. This integration of one and many could facilitate the inclusion of different epistemologies, such as those of indigenous cultures, regardless of their commensurability or incommensurability with hegemonic cultures. Instead of invalidating the truths of people whose context differs from one's own, we can evolve language to be able to contain seemingly contradictory truths from radically different contexts. This is perhaps the next step on our cultural evolutionary journey. Thank you very much. I'd just like to share with you, lastly here, these are the books. This is a novel. This one is nonfiction. It will be coming out in January, hopefully. Keep fingers crossed. And here are ways to see more about what I do and get in touch with me if you'd like to do that. So, do we have time for any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a very insightful and very creative presentation. And of course, our respected participant and viewer, they are enriched by your creative presentation. Now we invite the respected participant to share their reflections on this very presentation. So we'll invite Professor Gyan Glui to share his reflection. Yes, Dr. Gyan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on the subject. I have to reflect on it because, well, it was very stimulating. And the fields which were faced also very various. Therefore, I need to see it again and to meditate on it in order to be able to formulate some observations which are grounded, at least, because up to now I am a little bit afraid that I would say something which is not so appropriate. But it was really impressive, really impressive. I congratulate you very much because it had a very rich spectrum of ideas, of suggestions, of perspectives, of fields of research also, of course, and it opened perspectives for me about the transpositional subjectobjectivity, which I had not thought before, not at all. I must say it was a revelation, and therefore, no, I congratulate you very much, and I will see it again. We'll see the video again in order to fix some points better and some notices better. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. I request John Dalton. Yes, Ananta Bhai has indicated. Yes, Ananta Bhai,
Yeah,
over to you.
Lisa, thank you with my heart, and your presentation, it's really a sadhana of language, of biology, physics, and it is really deep. And the challenge, like my internet just got delinked, in the sense that it is a evolutionary moment and many unexpected challenges happen. So thank you so much from my heart.
Thank you for inviting me. I am deeply honored.
Yes, John Dodson to share some of his reflection.
I think another term I would enter into our discussion just as an addendum would be the term that Jean Gebser, and I'm not sure that his name is familiar to everyone. I seem not to have the capacity to enter a chat. But the term atemporality or atemporality as well as aperspectivity, meaning all perspectives held, none excluded, no perspective diminished by wholeness. And Lisa, you might type in atemporality. I mean, it's obvious enough. But I must say, again, what a thrill it is to connect with each of you. I did travel in India about 30 years ago and have studied Vedanta 50 years ago to begin with. And how we are able, even in this very moment, to communicate as best we can, and how difficult it may be, how provocative it may be. All the energies that are involved in this communication event right now, in the nowness of it. I was very drawn 5 decades ago into Vedanta, and I could claim nothing other than the most naive awareness of Vedanta, but I certainly I did participate in pranayama yoga south of Bangalore. But what a miracle it is that we can have this session that indeed in its ways is atemporal, atemporal, and also aspatial. It would be unimaginable to me 30 years ago. It was unimaginable to me that I would be able to participate in a conference with you in, shall we say, real time. Perhaps I'll stop there. The very notion of real time is a bit difficult to define if we dig into it, as Lisa has said, through the scales of magnitude. As what is it that is happening in this session and in all the sessions that the group has enjoined? I would look forward and respectfully to join future sessions as well. And I'm very grateful to have met Dr. Ananta Giri in San Francisco and to have shared integral moments there. So I've spun out some utterances here that I hope may have connected with some of you. And I'm most grateful for the connection and for Lisa's work here, all of which I have some familiarity with and find it to be very fertile.
Thank you, John Dodson. We look forward for your kind participation in our dialogue. We invite people from different fields of life to share their knowledge on every Sunday. So we look forward. We are also joined by our respected friend, Dr. Tejaswini Patil and Minati Pradhanji. So I invite them to share their reflections on this very presentation. Yes, Minati Pradhan.
Hello, am I audible? Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to thank Madam Lisa Maroski for her very enlightening presentation. It is enriched, manifold, I must say, by this presentation. But to ask a question, I need to assimilate all the concepts well. So, which is same like Professor Ganluji said, I need to go through again go through the video and assimilate a little more. For this time, I am just grateful and I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minati. Professor Jaykant Tiwari has also joined for today's session. So I invite Professor Jaykant Tiwari to share some of his reflection. As they are taking some time, maybe final word from Ananta Bhai, and then we'll invite Minati ji again to offer vote of thanks.
Thank you. But maybe Randhir, you would have some thoughts, one or two lines, then I would come, please.
Yes, I was just surprised to see this conceptualization of transpositional subject objectivity itself. And I have to again revisit this recording. But it is very important that, our anthropological gaze is developing epistemological trust. And that is something which is important. And I would again read this article written by Lisa Maroski and your book, and then I will comment. So thank you.
Thank you. And as Lisa very kindly, it's like she so deeply mentioned as a modern mystic. And that is so important, this self-identity of her as a modern mystic, which also is an invitation to each one of us to be mystic in that sense. And the path of the mystical, as Lisa embodies, the path of the mystical is also entwined with the historical. And like her very deep reference to contemporary movements like the Zapatista, and not only contemporary frontier transcending thinkers like David Bohm and others, many thinkers from different fields, but also contemporary movements. So therefore, one way of realizing is that bringing the mystical and the historical together. And as John mentioned about Vedanta, and for example, some transcultural Christian theologians like Swami Abhisiktananda and his journey with Vedanta, and that has been an inspiration for bringing the prophetic from the Christian and the Abrahamic tradition in dialogue with the mystical. So therefore, this kind of the evolutionary leap that Lisa is really inviting us to realize is also one way of bringing the prophetic, that prophetic work. For example, creating a new language and the challenge of it, and her mentioning that it is a sacred act, and that sacrality, it has to be done with a lot of caution, like giving birth to, and so this points to that. The other thing is that the whole invitation, very deep invitation that Lisa is presenting to understand the difference between speaking about and speaking from, but that also is interlinked with another interlinked mode, which we can think about as speaking with. So in a way, speaking from is part of a way of speaking with. So speaking together with, and that speaking together with, and I request Lisa to kindly reflect, help us reflect a bit on that. That speaking together with, for example, it would include this kind of border crossing act between the human and the non-human, and the very deep reflection that she has shared. And that speaking together with is also a process of speech and silence, language and silence. And in terms of thoughts, like you have referred to Heidegger. Heidegger, in his talk on language, he talks about language as a way-making movement, and then bringing that, for example, the limitation of form. What you mentioned, that the very form of being or the language of being is inadequate to express or realize the deep vastness that is connoted by the word being. So therefore, looking at language not only as a form, which Wittgenstein suggests, but Heidegger as a way-making movement, and that way-making movement is how we become part of the way-making movement by ourselves becoming the way. And therefore the multi-perspectival is realized in our moment of way, being on the way, being with the way. So these are and finally this depth dimension is so important, that how the depth in Sri Aurobindo and the mother in that integral yoga, there is the reference to the fourth dimension of human existence. See, mother also talks about the psyche. So in fact, this depth dimension is that where the vertical and the integral, the vertical and the horizontal are intertwined in manifold ways. So these are some of my, very humble submissions to you, and now looking forward to a little bit of
So
your
I
kind
would thank you. Yes, those are wonderful reflections. And when you mention speaking with, that's a very a good thing to add, because it allows us to, as Martin Buber mentioned, see the sacred in the other. And speaking with is not speaking to somebody as an object, but engaging and merging your being with them, so that the speaking arises within the field that the two people or more, it could be all of us here together today, that we all share, that our being with a capital B is all merging. So for today, this community of individual beings in different space-time configurations can be conceived of as a single being, and our unified subject objectivity is creating something that did not exist before. This group right now, we have created a new being by being here together. I'd also like to extend the metaphor of, as my microbes are to me, they're performing all kinds of functions within me. Some are digesting food, some are being protectors against viruses coming in. As they are to me, we humans and other beings in and on Earth are to Earth. So by expanding our sense of wholeness to be wholes within a greater whole, to know that we have a a very important function that we're performing for the whole right now with our lives, it's a profound way of being in the world, and it brings a kind of sacredness to whatever you're doing at the moment, whether it's making tea or you know talking live on Facebook.
Yes, yes. And therefore, that sacrality is really the sacredness of life. And one of the important challenge is what is really connoted here, that modernity kind of, you know, unilaterally constructed the world as disenchanted. And so therefore, in that very unilaterally constructed, disenchanted world, how do we realize re-enchantment as a living experience, and in everything that we do? And language here helps us. You mentioned about intimacy in that sense, that the intimacy of language. And today there is one pool of language is so objectifying and so devoid of emotion. And in a way, many languages have become so speedy. Like I have been in Denmark, and all these languages earlier they were spoken with a little bit of more rhythm, and now what the great geographer David Harvey, the great thinker, talks about space-time compression, is that it is affecting language, is that, but in those moments of space-time compression, how do we still create these moments of intimacy of language, kind of extend it? Sri Aurobindo uses very two important words in his Savitri. In a way, humbly I feel when I am in your presence that your work is really a Savitri of a language, the kind of the new language, as Savitri is trying to revive the dead. And your work is in that spirit, that we would have to bring birth to a new language, and that is a Savitri work. So a new language, a new poetry, for example. Because what happened is that in our earlier modes of transformations, poetry played a very important role. But what has happened in modernity, for many things, there is the prose, and prose has been the language of revolution in that sense, and it was necessary at that moment. But that prose has been so prosaic that it has become a victim of what can be called as prosaic fundamentalism. So therefore, to free us from that prosaic fundamentalism, we need a new kind of poetry. And therefore, the poetic becomes a way of giving birth to a new language, a new experience of the paradoxical. It is in that spirit, with humility, I want to present a few lines of a poem. It is called I and We. No, it is called I and I referring to EYE.
Okay.
And it goes like this: I is I and I alone. That means EYE. Or is I also an ear? Is I a we? An ear of the soul and the other, eye of the heart. Because with all these things, what is really implicated is the heart, isn't it? And you are really inviting us to bring our heart to all these dimensions. And in German language, there is a very beautiful word called Harzwerk. And I was visiting Germany in 2006, and I was meeting two very important souls, and one in an educator and her friend and husband is a activist in Latin America, and he wrote a book on his work with the marginalized people as Harzwerk, as work of the heart. Again, your reference to Zapatista in the sense that the Zapatista, that in one there is in one world many worlds are possible. It's a work of the heart. It's a work of the language, and they talks about intergalactic dialogue, because a social movement talking about intergalactic dialogue, now 30 years ago. So, and now today, our communication in the sense of the cosmic communication, in the sense now what is happening. So these are my, and I just wish to say that I was in the Zapatista lane in San Cristobal La Casa in 2005. And so then I stayed with the Zapatistas for a few days in there. So therefore, what is important is that these new ways of thoughts and social movements, they are coming together. And another very interesting axis of that is that the whole interspecies thinking. Now there's a very deep movement about interspecies thinking, like Donna Haraway talking about the whole cross species, and she herself is saying that this cross species thinking has been facilitated by what is called as the alter globalization movement. Therefore, the social movements that are happening, and if our work on philosophy and language, and if the social movements themselves, in a spirit of the depth dimension, maybe for kind of the challenge of the immediacy, they are not able to go a little deeper. But if the social movements do the depth kind of work that you are suggesting, and the depth work that you and some other friends are doing, that is already inspired by social movements, but that is also the fertile ground for cross fertilization. From this womb, the evolutionary leap is going to happen, because what we need is adventure. And A.N. Whitehead, for example, who is a great process philosopher, he talked about adventure of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But the adventure of ideas is also adventure of relationship. So Sri Aurobindo talks about adventure. He has a very beautiful poem called Invitation, and he says, with the wind and the weather beating around me, up to the hills and the moorland I go. Who will come with me? Who will, who will climb with me? Wade through the brooks and down with the snow.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Um, when we think we're separate, okay, it's like we can only see the fingers, and our language has been maximized for finger A talking to finger C. How are we going to speak when we realize that actually we're all connected already anyway? And we just have forgotten that finger A and finger C are all part of this greater being. It's going to be, well, we have to participate in this. This is the important thing, is it's not going to just sort of randomly happen. We have to help ourselves along in that way. So
Thank you.
I think, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really very enriching and enlightening session. Thank you.